Why 4 Gospels? Why do we have 4 Gospels in our New Testament? There's both theological reasons and historical reasons. Theologically, we could say the Holy Spirit wanted to give us 4 unique perspectives on Jesus. We get a more full picture of who He was and what He came to accomplish by getting 4 different perspectives. There are not only theological reasons, though, there's historical reasons. The Gospels arose in different Christian communities and were written to address the needs and concerns of particular communities within the church. This issue of the different communities to whom the Gospels are written raises a related question of the Gospel audiences. To whom specifically were the Gospels written? Almost all scholars agree that the Gospels were written primarily to Christian audiences. Even though, of course, the Gospel writers wanted their Gospels to be read by unbelievers, they're primarily writing to address the needs and concerns of believers. There's been a tendency over the last century to view each of the Gospels as written to a specific Christian community, specific church or groups of churches to address their needs. For example, Mark's Gospel is commonly viewed as written to the church at Rome, the suffering and persecuted church at Rome, to encourage them in that persecution. This idea of very specific gospel audience has been challenged in recent years by Richard Bauckham and some others. These individuals have claimed that the Gospels were not written to isolated Christian communities, but rather were intended from the beginning for a much broader Christian audience. Bauckham points to the evidence of the Pauline letters, for example, to show this. The Pauline letters show a great deal of communication and travel among the Christian communities, this wonderful network among the believers. So Bauckham suggests the Gospels, like Paul's letters, were likely intended from the beginning to be copied and passed on, to be used by the broader Christian audience. This broader audience is also suggested by the literary interdependence of the Gospels. We'll talk about this later. But if Mark was very early known and the source for Matthew and Luke, it must have had a fairly wide distribution, almost from the beginning, at least soon after it was written. So did the Gospel writers have one audience in mind, or were they expecting their Gospels to be read by Christians around the world? The truth is likely somewhere between these two extremes. The Gospel writers were almost certainly part of individual churches and wrote to address the needs of those communities. Matthew is almost certainly written to a group of Jewish Christians, Mark to a persecuted body of believers. But it's also likely that these communities were connected to the larger network of churches, and the Gospel writers, even as they wrote, had this larger audience in mind.